A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
In response to the rabbi's statements regarding the possible Karaite origins of the Ashkenazi minhag of refraining from consuming Kitniyot during Pesach, the Yeshiva World website published a response by Rabbi Yair Hoffman. Whereas the rabbi had claimed that Rambam refers to practices of Karaite origin making their way into halachic Judaism, and that the same may have occurred with regards to Kitniyot, Rabbi Hoffman insists that Rambam refers not to Karaites, but to Tzadukim or Saducees. What is the rabbi's response to these claims?
Allow me to begin by stating that I only spoke of a possibility, perhaps a likelihood, but certainly not a certainty, that the practice of the Ashkenazim to refrain from eating Kitniyot during Pesach is based on Karaite origins. But I believe it is possible, and the reason I suggested this was twofold. A, the practice itself is so obviously and blatantly opposed to the Torah Sheba'al Peh, to the essence of what Chazal tell us regarding the definition of Chametz, that one has to search rather far afield to find any kind of rationalization whatever for such a practice. Second of all, it is a fact that at least part of the Karaite communities around the world, for many, many centuries, if not longer, have refrained from eating rice, in some cases, in other cases beans, during Pesach, which of course is very reminiscent of this practice. As for the claim that the Rambam, to which I referred, who mentions certain practices having crept into mainstream halachic Judaism, having their source in practices and halachic positions of the Tzadukim, as the Rambam writes in Ilchot Isurei Bia Perek Yud Aleph, regarding a certain detail of Ilchot Nidah, and the claim that this refers to Tzadukim and not to Karaites, this claim I must reject out of hand. The notion that there is a clear and obvious distinction between the Tzadukim, as the term is used by Rambam at least, and the concept or the term Karaim, as being two distinct concepts, and therefore if the Rambam chose to use the term Tzadukim, he clearly could not have meant Karaim. This is entirely spurious, and we have at least 2 or 3 proofs in the Rambam's own hand to this effect. One such source is in the Rambam's commentary on Masechet Avot, the tractate Avot in the Mishnah. In the first chapter, Halacha Gimel, Mishnah Gimel, Rambam speaks about the 2 sects known as the Tzadukim and the Baitosim, who are mentioned in Avot Rabbi Nathan Perek Hey, with regards to the Mishnah speaking of Antigonos Ish Sochor, who had 2 students who decided that there is no such thing as reward and punishment, and that Hashem does not reward, does not punish, and therefore one can do as one pleases. This is referred to by, in the Avot Rabbi Natan, and Rambam quotes this in his commentary. And Rambam writes as follows. He first describes the emergence of these 2 sects, the Tzadukim and the Baitosim, and then he writes, Umeaz kamu elu hakitoth ha'aruroth kevutzot haminim hanikraim be'eretz hazo klomar mitzrayim karaim. In other words, and since that time, there have arisen here groups of minim, that is to say, of sectarians, people who reject the teachings of the Torah or parts of the Torah, here in this country of Mitzrayim, this land where I live at the present time, says the Rambam, and these people are called Karaim. Ushmam etzel hachamim tzadukim uvaitosim, and they are known in the parlance of the Chachamim, the term used by the Chachamim to refer to these Karaim is Sadukim and Vaitusim. This is written here in the Rambam, in his commentary on this Mishnah, Perek Aleph, Halacha Gimel, Masechet Avot. In other words, the Rambam says explicitly, clearly, unambiguously, that the terms Karaim and Sadukim are entirely synonymous. It follows, therefore, that when Rambam speaks of Sadukim in his book, the Mishneh Torah, it is entirely reasonable to claim, and in fact likely, that he is referring to not to the ancient Sadukim and Baithosim of the time of the Second Temple, where that particular practice which the Rambam refers there in Ilchot Isurei Biyah is not known from that time, but rather to the Karaim, with regards to whom this practice is known. So the Rambam refers to them as Sadukim, but he refers to the Karaim, and this is just a synonymous term, as the Rambam himself makes very clear. A further source that we have in Rambam's writings is a Teshuvah, a responsum of Rambam, Siman Resh Samech Gimel 263, in his printed responsa, where he refers to the practice of certain Jews in his time, and even to this day there are those who have this custom, of standing in the Bet Knesset when the Ten Commandments are read from the Torah. And Rambam, like other Chachamim, was very opposed to this practice because they saw in it a practice which was similar to or reminiscent of the practice of the Minim, that is to say, those who claimed that certain parts of the Torah, such as the Ten Commandments, have a different status and a higher status than other parts of the Torah, and that this belief is pernicious and very, very wrong, and therefore we must do everything in our power, says the Rambam, or those who actually ask the Rambam this question. They actually write these words in their question. They say we must distance ourselves in every way from any practice that is held to and that is adhered to by those who believe in such pernicious beliefs. The Rambam agrees with this position and says that yes, it's true. This is in some ways similar to their practices, and they're reminiscent of their beliefs, and therefore it is to be avoided. And this, by the way, is also an argument against the practice of not eating Kitniyot, because if it is true, and it is in fact true, that the Karaites have such a practice, or some of them certainly have such a practice, to refrain from eating rice and beans and the like during Pesach, that itself is an argument for us authentic halachic Jews not to do so. But more particularly, more precisely, the Rambam writes in this Teshuvah, وَأَلُوا Karaim, those known as the Karaim nowadays, in his day, Enam ele asher korim otam chachamim minim. They are not the people referred to by the Chachamim by the term minim. Ela korim otam sadukim uvaithosim. These are those referred to by the Chachamim as sadukim and baithosim, Sadducees and Baithusians, lohotzia kutim, as opposed to the kutim. And this is written here in this Shuvah of the Rambam, page 499, Siman Rei Samach Gimel. So here we have in two separate sources in the Rambam himself the explicit statement that the word Sadukim and the term Karaim are synonymous. And therefore, if I referred to a certain statement in Rambam's writings where he refers to a practice having entered mainstream Judaism from the circles of the Sadukim, this certainly can and almost certainly should be understood as referring to the Karaim, because these terms are essentially one and the same. So this claim must be rejected out of hand. Another further claim that Rabbi Hoffman made was that there were no Karaim in France at the time when this practice began. And here I should mention, first of all, that it is not entirely clear that the practice began necessarily in France, but it's possible that it began in France and in Germany, in Ashkenaz and Tzorfat simultaneously. We have from approximately the same period indications that this custom grew up in these two communities in Europe, but the reasons given by these different communities are quite different and very telling. The explanation offered by the Baal HaRokeach in his drasha for Pesach is that sometimes wheat grains are mixed up in other kinds of grain-like substances such as rice or legumes. And this claim, one should add, is rejected out of hand by all the Rishonim, such as the Tur, who writes about this, that this is a humra yetera, an unnecessary and extreme stringency. The explanation given for this practice by those who were familiar with this practice, even though they disagreed with it, in France, in the south and the north of France, was that this is some secondary form of chametz, that Kitniyot are actually a secondary form of chametz. And this claim is the one that is reminiscent of the Karaite stance regarding Kitniyot during Pesach. And the claim that there were no Karaites in France and therefore this cannot possibly be the result of Karaite influence, I find very unconvincing, simply because no one knows for a fact exactly where Karaites lived, where all the Karaites in the world lived. Some claim that there were many Karaites in many parts of the Jewish world, throughout the Jewish world. We also know that during the time of the First Crusade, the Crusaders and all their followers traveled through the different lands from France on their way to the Holy Land through Byzantium, and Byzantium was exactly where there were many Karaites, and there were trade routes that went through these lands, and it's not at all unfeasible that, or unlikely, that views and opinions and practices from that part of the world became known in other parts of the world, which are after all not so distant from well-known centers of Karaite population, apart from the fact that we don't know for a fact, it can't be said with any certainty that there were not Karaites in these different countries as well, perhaps in smaller concentrations and therefore less well known historically, but to claim that there was no such possibility of any such contact or influence is certainly a claim without any firm base. And therefore, what we remain with after the end of all of this is the simple fact that almost every single Rishon, every single medieval halachic authority that was aware of this minhag rejected it out of hand. It is, after all, a very rare thing indeed to hear one of the Rishonim referring to a minhag, any minhag, as being a minhag shetuf, as a foolish practice. But this is exactly what Rabbi Yerucham writes about the minhag of Kitniyot. It's unusual to find a major authority writing about a practice that is already quite well known as being a humra yetera, an unnecessary stringency. But this is exactly what the Torah writes about this practice. And the list is very long. In fact, one is very hard put to find any authority who supported this practice and who saw it as being legitimate in any way at all. And the number of Chachamim who rejected it out of hand and spoke against it in very plain and even harsh terms is very long. And therefore, this practice remains a curiosity, something which flies in the face of the Tasha Baal Peh, traditional, the oral tradition of the Jewish people regarding the meaning of the Torah and normative Jewish practice.
Can the rabbi please mention by name some of the halachic authorities who were opposed to this practice?
It's actually very simple to mention these authorities by name because there are very many and their statements are well known. On the other hand, to find authorities, great halachic authorities from the time of the Rishonim, medieval period, who supported this practice, one has to look very far and wide, and one basically finds no one who openly supported this practice. In Germany, in Ashkenaz, despite the fact that the Baal HaRokeach, Rabbi Elazar of Worms, was of the view that it is a good idea to refrain from eating Kitniyot, other Chachamim in Germany, in Ashkenaz, such as the Mordechai, the Tur, who refers to it as a humra yetera, an unnecessary and extreme stringency, and the Rosh, were all of the opinion that one may eat rice and other Kitniyot, etc. during Pesach. As for France, Tzofat, we know that the greatest sages of the generation, people like Rabbeinu Yehuda mi Paris, Rabbeinu Asher mi Lunel in his Sefer Minhagot, and Rabbeinu Yerucham, who referred to this as a minhag shtuf, a foolish practice, they all, and many others, were entirely opposed to this practice and saw it as some very difficult to explain aberration. And it is therefore proper that we follow in the footsteps of almost all the Rishonim without exception, and reject this minhag out of hand, because it contradicts the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and it resembles or is reminiscent of the minhagim of the Karaites.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.